Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Sideswipe MMA betting podcast. With our first pay-per-view of the year in the rearview mirror, we're back again at the Apex for 2 weeks in a row, firstly with a card headlined by Roman Dolidze and Nassourdine Imavov. But before we get into that card, I do quickly want to recap my performance of UFC 297. I won 3.39 units with bets on Jasmine Jasudavicius, Gillian Robertson, Raymond Taveras, and Movsar Evloev, but losses on the overs of Gordon versus Flick and also the money line on Brad Katona took away from what otherwise would have been a very profitable evening. Looking back at my breakdowns for that card, I had some incredibly sharp takes. I think I highlighted value on literally every single underdog that won. If I'd have been a bit more trigger happy with my bets, I think I genuinely could have got double digits in profit on that card, but I'm still happy with the conservative approach that I'm looking to have this year. Last event successes do blend into this card though, as I also had a couple of parlays that now have a single leg remaining from winners on that UFC 297 card, so I'm expecting big things from UFC Vegas 85. So let's not waste any more time dwelling on the past, let's break down this card. In our main event of the evening, we have a bout between Roman Dolidze versus Nassourdine Imavov in the middleweight division. I've got a good record with both guys here, and they're two fighters that I think I have a pretty good read on. I've got a 5-1 record on Dolidze's fights, only being incorrect on picking Jack Hermansson to beat him, and that was a fight that Jack Hermansson was winning 90+% of. And I'm also 4-1 on betting on Imavov's fights when I lost out on an underdog bet against Phil Hawes in a fight that I really think should have been a draw. So as of 2024, my opinion of Roman Dolidze is that he is very, very overrated. I understand that he's got a really good skill set on paper, and his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is definitely something that you need to respect, but the guy just doesn't take fights seriously, and he's a pretty average striker outside of knockout power. I think he's being overrated due to his performance in that Marvin Vettori fight last year, where he outperformed his price tag and did look competitive against one of the division's top 5 fighters who, if Israel Adesanya didn't exist, would probably have been champion at the time. I respected the performance and I was impressed with it, but honestly, Marvin Vettori followed that fight up with an atrocious performance against Jared Cannonier, and I know people are very trigger happy to say this these days, but I think Vettori might be washed. Maybe washed is a bit far, but I do think he definitely has taken a couple of steps back in his career. So I think my opinion of Dolidze kind of had to be recalibrated because of how Vettori looks these days. And if Vettori is at his worst and Dolidze was the first one to face him, he's kind of just got the rub of the green and made to look a lot better than he really is. So I think it's something to actually be quite cautious of. Nassourdine Imavov is kind of suffering the opposite fate at the moment because he put in a brilliant performance against Chris Curtis in his last fight, only for an accidental headbutt to rob him of the win and instead turn it into a no contest. It does make me wonder if the books remembered that Vettori's no longer a top 5 guy, and they also remembered that Imavov's performance against Curtis was an absolute domination of a guy who is pretty well rounded and hard to look great against. Does this line really deserve to be minus 150 if you factor those things in? So in terms of breaking down the actual fight, I think that Nassourdine Imavov is the more fluent and technical striker. I think he's a better wrestler. I think he has far superior cardio, and I don't think that his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is bad either. This one seems like a pretty clear contest of a minute winner versus a finisher, and I think that Imavov should win it pretty cleanly as long as he stays safe from the power and that opportunistic submission threat. I think if we get 25 minutes here, Imavov should really be showing himself as a head and shoulders more competitive fighter. I was very keen to make a bet on Jack Hermansson for similar reasons in his fight against Dolidze a couple of years ago. And for 95% of that fight, I think I was cruising and I think I felt like a bit of a genius. I know how that fight ended with a really clever and intricate calf slicer submission from Dolidze. But if Jack Hermansson can establish himself as a superior fighter against you minute by minute, then I think Nassourdine Imavov has the potential to embarrass you. Obviously, you can't really ignore a finish like that, and it shows how opportunistic and savvy Roman Dolidze is with his grappling, and also we know that he's a hard hitter, so you do have to be cautious to a certain extent. But I don't think that lightning strikes twice here like it did in that Hermansson fight, so I'll gladly be betting on Imavov for 2 units at minus 150. I still think that the Frenchman has potential to be a top 5 fighter at middleweight, despite that loss to Sean Strickland, and I think he could honestly look minus 300 in hindsight here. So I would be betting it for more, but honestly, that dangerousness and the power that Dolidze has can obviously spook you a little bit, so I won't go too committed, but 2 units is more than enough for me. I personally think that Imavov should be minus 200 in this spot. It's a clear value bet in my opinion. Happy to pull the trigger on that. In our co-main event, we have a showdown between Renato Moicano and Drew Dober. This is a sensational piece of matchmaking in my opinion. You've got 2 fan favourites who know how to have fun, they know how to brawl and have a great time inside the cage, but also 2 guys who have recently shown some inconsistencies and glimpses of frailty in recent years. So you've got the good, you've got the bad, you've just got a mixture of things. This one's probably going to be very chaotic. It kind of goes without saying, but Renato Moicano is obviously the more well-rounded fighter of the two of them, but for as good of a striker as he can look when he's comfortable, he can absolutely be got at and bossed around if you've earned his respect and he hasn't earned yours. Drew Dober is obviously the more one-dimensional of the two of them, but that focus is in the striking department, where Dober hits incredibly hard, he has speed, he has volume, and he has athleticism in spades. Moicano should really be looking to wrestle in this one, therefore, because that is where he has the path of least resistance. I think he's the kind of striker that will give ground to Drew Dober, will give him too much respect, and will therefore probably just be too afraid of the knockout to really throw anything back on the return. I just can't see a world where Moicano manages to stay safe on the feet if they fight for long periods at striking distance, and if they go blow for blow, balls to the wall, there's only really one guy who's going to win, and that's Drew Dober. So that sounds very much like I'm leaning towards Dober on the money line here, and value-wise I definitely am. But there are obviously some concerns on the Dober side. He's never really been the best defensive wrestler or grappler, and I do have serious concerns about his ability to stay safe from a dangerous submission threat like Moicano. Having said that, Dober does seem aware of where he is incapable, because if you do watch glimpses of him actually being taken down on the mat against good grapplers, he likes to just sort of lock down position in full guard and sort of wait for the referee or wait for his opponent to try and make a move and explode back to his feet where he can. Obviously, against someone who's a great back taker like Renato Moicano, that is going to be a bit of a problem, and he does need to be careful with how he chooses to stand back up. But if Dober is going to remain calm and not act like a fish out of water and just be patient when he does get taken down on the mat, I think he can have the patience to survive and just wait the round out and then start again on the feet in the next 5 minutes. So in my mind, a win for Dober looks very similar to the Bobby Green fight, where Dober gets tagged a fair bit, but manages to create an environment in the second round to land the bombs that he needs and have that sort of close distance phone booth kind of fight. I've always thought that Moicano was a bit of a flake in the striking department. To me, he is someone who is a very talented mixed martial artist, but his lack of grit and determination as a cage fighter is kind of always going to be something that's going to plague him. In a way, I kind of see him as a far worse example of the guy that Charles Oliveira used to be accused of being all those years ago. So you've probably guessed it by now, but I am on Drew Dober in this spot. I can see the flaws, and I'm not saying it's a confident play, and if he does get submitted by Moicano, I won't be too surprised. But I just think he should be the favourite here. He shouldn't be a plus money underdog. I saw a little bit of value when it was a pick'em, but now that he's moved to plus 110, I think it's time to get involved. I haven't made the bet yet, as the market still has the potential to move, but I will have 1.5 units on Drew Dober's money line at plus 110 or better, with a further half unit on him to win by KO. Not sure what the price is going to be there, but I'm thinking something around plus 175 to plus 200. I think Dober should be 55% probability to win this fight, which is minus 125, so I am getting a decent amount of value on this bet. Very happy to take it. So next up on the main card, we have a bout between Randy Brown and Muslim Salikhov, which is a rescheduled one from the UFC 296 card. Obviously, if you've been listening to my podcast since I started it, I have a personal narrative with this fight because I had 7.5 units on Randy Brown, but significantly I had him at minus 188 in a single, as well as a minus 110 in a parlay with Shavkat Rakhmonov. As you can imagine, I'm pretty pissed off that they're rebooking this one because I had such a great line, and the opening line was something like minus 275 on Randy Brown, so all that CLV I was supposed to have was just robbed of me. To be fair though, it was Randy Brown who was ill that day, so I am glad that he pulled out of the fight, because if he'd have fought whilst compromised, I probably would have ended up losing a lot, so I can't really be too mad about it. Anyway, nothing at all has changed since my original breakdown. Unfortunately, I've deleted the file, so we're going to have to go through this one all over again. I basically think that there's a bit of value on Randy Brown if you're getting him at around minus 230, because I think he should be minus 300 here. I therefore parlayed him for 2 units alongside Johan Lainez versus Sam Patterson to last under 2.5 rounds at UFC 297, which is already cashed. So this is basically a single on Randy Brown at minus 130 for 2 units. So to give you the actual summary of what my breakdown was supposed to be, essentially I just think that Randy Brown is better everywhere here. Muslim Salikhov is 39 years old and he's still painfully one-dimensional. He's not a bad striker, but he's just getting slower and more plodding as he gets older, and he just doesn't have a very inspiring striking style. He's not much of a pressure fighter either, which is going to be a struggle considering he's at a pretty decent size and reach disadvantage. So playing the kickboxing game against Randy Brown is probably one that's not really going to work for Muslim Salikhov. Salikhov's also benefited from not facing a particularly good grappler in his UFC career, and it hasn't taken much for opponents to demonstrate a clear grappling advantage against him on the mat. See his Alex Garcia debut loss as a good example. He's also not got very good cardio for like a medium-paced 15-minute affair. He went most recently against Nicholas Dalby and lost 30-27s. I know Nicholas Dalby is somebody that we think of as like actually a really good fighter because he pulled off that massive upset, but Dalby's not that good, and for him to be losing that fight so convincingly is pretty bad, I would say. So yeah, I just simply think there's a big difference in athleticism, speed, cardio, diversity of striking, and youthfulness here, and all of that favours Randy Brown. The only advantage I give to Muslim Salikhov is pure power, and he hasn't really shown a scary one-punch knockout kind of style anyway. There is a path to victory for Salikhov, but it's a very small one. I don't think it happens more than 25% of the time, therefore I think Randy Brown should be minus 300. And I was happy to use him as a parlay piece when the line is significantly lower than that. Since UFC 297, the price on Randy Brown has actually gotten a little bit better. You can now get him around minus 225. So I therefore added one more unit on Brown and Natalia Silva to win in a double at plus 100, and we'll move on to that fight now. Next up, we have a women's flyweight showdown between Viviane Araujo and Natalia Silva. Personally, I think this is a pretty easy one to analyse. Natalia Silva has been the most exciting women's MMA prospect that we've seen outside of the top 5 for a decent amount of time now, so the price is obviously going to be a bit short and reflect that, but I do think she's good for it. Personally, I've always seen her as somebody who has the talent to go right to the very top of the division, and I bet her as a plus 200 underdog against Jasmine Jasudavicius in her debut, so I do have the receipts to be able to say that. I have, however, also been a bit of a Viviane Araujo believer as well. I bet her in her short notice debut as well, where she won a rare one-punch women's MMA KO as a big underdog in the 3rd round, and I also bet her in her most recent win as an underdog to Jennifer Maia, so I do think I have a pretty good read on the girl's skill sets. Unfortunately for Viviane Araujo, I just don't think that Natalia Silva is inferior to her in any way. Natalia is lighter on her feet and will have the higher volume in this fight, and also the much better defense, which is pretty much all you're going to need in a women's MMA striking affair, because power isn't really something that factors in a whole lot. On the subject of power, Natalia Silva has shown herself to be the more dangerous of the two. She has multiple stoppage victories in the UFC, which is something you don't often say for women. But most importantly, Natalia Silva has far superior cardio, which plays a huge factor when a fight like this should go 15 minutes. Viviane Araujo's biggest weakness, and something that has prevented her from being at the top of the division, is because she wins round 3 at a very low clip. She just does not have the cardio for 15 minutes. She either paces herself and risks losing rounds 1 or 2 so that she can be good for round 3, or she commits to winning the first 2 and struggles her way through the 3rd. If you rewatch a lot of Araujo's round 3s in her UFC career, she either turns them into 50-50 affairs or she just outright loses them. And against someone like Natalia Silva, who is going to be there for 15 minutes, I think that's a dangerous thing because it automatically sets her up to be losing one of the 3 rounds. So I think this is low-key a nightmare matchup for Viviane Araujo, and I do actually think there's enough value on the betting line to use Natalia Silva as a parlay piece. I just don't see how she loses this one unless she has an off night, and there's nothing you can do to prevent that. It does happen from time to time, but we trust that fighters are going to perform at their best. We've also seen Araujo have off nights recently, because she's had underwhelming performances against Amanda Ribas and against Alexa Grasso. So if there's any fighter that we're supposed to be worried about here, it's probably going to be Araujo anyway. I'm very confident in Natalia Silva here, so I decided to get my business done early, initially combining her with Jasmine Jasudavicius at minus 120 at the UFC 297 card. Obviously the first half of that's already cashed, so it's basically now a single bet. Also, as previously mentioned, I added another unit with her to win alongside Randy Brown at plus 100 for this card. A lot of people did question why I was using Jasudavicius so heavily across 6 units at minus 350, but I think if you've watched that fight, minus 350 wasn't short enough a price. I do pride myself on being very smart and very sharp at women's MMA betting. My return on investment last year was about 13% on it, which is pretty good, and I've already won a variety of bets this year on it. So whilst people may be uncomfortable with the idea of playing women's MMA fighters at minus 250 or prices like that, I personally think it's easier to bet on women's MMA than men's because the high variance of power and knockouts is a lot less likely to play a factor, and I think a fight like this really demonstrates that. So for me, I think Natalia Silva is great value at minus 250. Use her in parlays. Definitely recommend that you do that if you can. So yeah, Natalia Silva all day. Next up, we have a showdown between guys with very long names as Aliashkab Khizriev faces Makhmud Muradov. Khizriev is your classic case of an unknown Russian prospect making their first few appearances in the UFC, and they're an absolute nightmare to analyse the skill set of. They come into the UFC or Dana White's Contender Series with a sexy, undefeated record that's almost exclusively built on the Russian regional scene, where it's impossible to know how good their opponents actually are and how many milliliters of steroids they've injected in the last 24 hours. The Russian prospect gets a generous matchup for their UFC debut, but because of the fact you're completely clueless about their actual skill set, it doesn't really help seeing them perform in their debut. If they're underwhelming, it could have been nerves or because they're off the juice, or if they perform well, it could have been because they're having a layup against a can. But then they get to their second UFC fight and it's usually against an actual semi-credible opponent, and you have no idea if the betting line is accurate or if there's super crazy value on either side because you know nothing about the guy that you're staring at. I think back to the likes of people like Albert Duraev, who had that exact same journey I just described. He got to his sophomore fight against Joaquin Buckley and he looked like shit. The UFC have never treated him the same ever since, and he's just a discarded prospect that they now use to prop up other people. Is Khizriev the same as that? I have absolutely no idea, and I don't think it's really possible to know unless you have a really intricate understanding of these Russian regional scenes, which honestly I don't. Therefore, I don't think it's worth thinking that hard about, and you might as well just wait for the information to form itself. If Khizriev wins this fight against Muradov with ease, or looks absolutely sensational in doing so, then sure, maybe we take his performances seriously and start looking at him as an actual prospect. But until he's done something like that, all opinions are valid, and he could be awful and he could be amazing. To make matters worse, his opponent, Makhmud Muradov, is capable of losing a striking battle with Gerald Meerschaert, so I don't really think I'd want to fade Khizriev with a guy like Muradov, even if I thought that Khizriev was a fraud. This fight just seems so unappealing to me from the moment that I saw it listed on the card, and again, gonna take the easy option and draw a line through it early. Sorry folks, I know it's boring, but it has to be done sometimes. If you want to blindly put your faith in Khizriev, I hope he ends up being legit, but if he turns out to be just another Russian can that crotch sniffs and can't do anything else, you can't be surprised. Literally any number is a valid betting line for this fight, so I don't really know what to say, so I'm not going to say anything. And our next fight, which I believe is on the main card for some crazy reason, we have Gilbert Urbina versus Charles Radtke. I'm going to start off by saying that I think that Charles Radtke's performance against Mike Mateta, the artist formerly known as Blood Diamond, kind of vindicated my negative opinion of him in the build-up to that fight. I know that nobody was picking Blood Diamond to win, but I did have a slight suspicion that he would have more success than he'd had in his previous UFC fights. I wasn't overly impressed by Charles Radtke's striking on the regional scene, and I also didn't think that his grappling was going to be good enough to necessarily be relied on to take advantage of how bad Blood Diamond's grappling was in the UFC. Given that Charles Radtke lasted one striking exchange before he bailed on the striking and then went into the grappling mode, and in doing so he lost one, maybe even 2 rounds if you're scoring it generously. He also landed 16% of his attempted takedowns, and he got outstruck by Mateta at range. I'd say that's a pretty bad performance against one of the easiest UFC opponents in history. So Radtke faces Gilbert Urbina in his sophomore UFC bout, with Gilbert coming off a very impressive win over Orion Kosi in his last bout. It's not the most challenging opponent. His one and only UFC win actually came against Blood Diamond, coincidentally. But that was a demonstration of exactly how you're supposed to handle a layup fight, and something that Charles Radtke should definitely be taking notes on, because Urbina was in control from the opening seconds. He was threatening with his striking and his submissions, and he just demonstrated a skill set that I think he could easily replicate against Radtke here. I think Urbina's got a significant grappling advantage in this fight as well, and another advantage in just general dangerousness. It also helps that he's noticeably bigger than Charles Radtke as well, which should help him to manage distance and take control of those grappling moments when he wants to. However, as we know, this is a fight between two guys who don't have a whole lot of UFC experience, so my opinions here are slightly on the lower confidence side. Urbina is still finding his feet in the UFC, and he's only really demonstrated his best work against a lower level of competition. But I personally don't think that Charles Radtke is a step up or down to Orion Kosi. It seems like pretty similar caliber, so if he can dominate that fight, I think he's absolutely got the opportunity to dominate here. Personally, I was fine with the idea of seeing Gilbert Urbina at minus 225 when the line initially was released at the start of the year, but for some reason a fair amount of money has actually come in on Radtke, which has pushed the line down to minus 160 on Urbina. I definitely see value there for sure, and I was waiting to see if the line could trim down even further to minus 150 before I jumped on. Unfortunately, I took my eyes off the ball for a couple of days, but I managed to grab him at minus 175 for 2 units before the line shot back up again. I wouldn't be betting any more than 2 units on this one simply for that reason, but I do think that Urbina is in a great spot here and has an opportunity to get another UFC win under his belt. So yeah, I think Gilbert Urbina should be minus 225 like he was initially. Urbina for the win here. And in the next fight, we have a super intricate and high-level affair as Molly McCann faces Diana Belbita. When the betting line for this one came out and Molly McCann emerged as a minus 250 favourite, I almost drop-kicked my nan down the stairs, rushing to my laptop to do tape. I've tried to fade Molly McCann at pretty much every opportunity, even as a UK guy, and the opportunity to bet on someone at plus 200 against her seemed like one I couldn't miss. But after I did some digging, I realised that this was actually a rematch, and Molly McCann won 30-25 on some of the judges' scorecards in the first fight. How is that even possible, I hear you ask? Well, it came from the second round, where Belbita was deducted a point for a blatant fence grab, and then she subsequently got mauled on the mat by McCann and lost 10-8, naturally. It's terrifying that somebody in the UFC could be so bad that they get out-grappled by Meatball, but Diana has never been a good fighter. It baffled me that so many people wanted to bet her against my girl Karolina Kowalkiewicz in their last fight. She's not UFC quality, and she never was, and Karolina is the GOAT. But for all the hate I can give Diana Belbita, Molly McCann is just in a weird spot in her career. I think she's been talking about all this weight class moving because she's in desperation mode. She got so much hype after the rise of Paddy Pimblett and those UFC London events in 2022 where she scored back-to-back knockouts, but she's been brought crashing back down to earth after her actual caliber has been exposed. She got dog-walked by a real prospect in Erin Blanchfield, and then she got embarrassed on home turf by Julia Stoliarenko, no less. In my opinion, Molly should just retire, and I think that is a narrative that's playing very strongly in her head. She's not going to be in the right frame of mind for this fight, in my opinion, because I think she's got one foot out the door. As somebody who lives in the UK, you can see that McCann definitely has a presence outside of fighting, and she has been doing other things like writing children's books and appearing more from like a punditry perspective and doing documentaries here and there. So I definitely think that she's starting to think about what her life looks like outside of fighting. Obviously, this is an appealing fight for her to take, considering she already has a win over Belbita, but I just don't really think you can trust Molly McCann with where she is at her career, i.e. the end. And again, Belbita's pretty shit herself. We saw how badly she got dominated in the first one. I don't think you could really roll the dice on her as an underdog here. So again, it seems like a pretty easy fight for me to pass on for her at minus 250, even for a women's MMA fight. You know I love those. I would say McCann should probably be around minus 175, which is nowhere near where she currently is, so there isn't really a bet for me. It's a pass. And next up, we have one of my favourite fighters of all time as Blake Bilder faces Jung Yong Lee. I had 5 units on Blake Bilder to beat Kyle Nelson last year, so it's kind of impossible for me to look at this one objectively. Blake Bilder put on the worst performance of the year in that fight, and one of the worst performances I have ever seen. And as somebody who had 5 units on him, the only word I can really say to describe how I felt was disgusted. And honestly, I'm therefore not going to trust him with a single penny ever again. But having said that, I don't really understand what makes Jun Yong Lee the favourite in this fight. He's from Road to UFC, which is a competition that I've already been quite critical of and said that it doesn't really say anything. It's a shit version of Dana White's Contender Series, and he won his last fight via a split decision that I personally think was semi-controversial and I think he should have lost. He's got an athletic physique, and the commentators really do want to hype him up as if he's some sort of super prospect with amazing striking. But all I saw was low volume and a fighter who doesn't actually understand how MMA works. The amount of cage pushing that he was being a victim of and the fact that he couldn't use a whizzer to turn himself out of that position was pretty shocking. So yeah, I actually think this is Blake Bilder's fight to lose if he wants it. If he goes out there with serious intent to clinch and wrestle and just be a pain in the arse and hustle for 15 minutes, he can outwork Lee and probably win the fight off of just sheer enthusiasm. Of course, the longer that he stays at kickboxing range, the more it's going to favour the South Korean, and Blake Bilder is defensively not very good. He gets tagged in almost every single fight. But I was underwhelmed by Lee's instincts and his ability to put stamps on rounds and put his foot on the gas and use that power to make sure that the damage metric was what was going to determine the round. And I really would not be surprised to see Blake Bilder weasel his way to an ugly-looking decision. You know, the kind of one where he backtracks a lot, skirts around the side of the cage, uses good footwork to avoid all the major shots, doesn't do anything impactful but lands like 4 takedowns and 6 minutes of grappling control and wins a gross decision. Kind of like Clay Guida, you know, the kind of vibe. But yeah, I won't be giving Blake Bilder a penny of my hard-earned money. Fuck that guy. It doesn't even matter that I think he's probably got value on his betting line here. I can't really recommend anyone rolls the dice on him because he's so untrustworthy. The way he was showboating against Kyle Nelson in that last fight honestly makes me sick. He gets hurt in a lot of his fights. Although he has been quite durable to fight through it, it's still not a great look and it will be scored against him on the scorecards. His cardio also looked really bad in that Nelson loss, which was the biggest surprise of all because I always thought he had pretty good cardio and a decent motor on him. And lastly, most importantly, his attitude fucking stunk in that fight. He was showboating, he was taking the piss out of Nelson, who was soundly beating him, and I think everyone saw it except for Blake Bilder. So do you really want to put your money on a fucking idiot like that? No. Do you really want to put your money on somebody who shouldn't even be the favourite? No. So don't bet on this fight. It should be a pick'em. Leave it alone. These Apex cards are so shit, man. Next up we have Julia Stoliarenko versus Luana Carolina. This is an easy one to break down, but it's a hard one to call. Stoliarenko is incredibly one-dimensional. Her chances of winning are based on one thing: how good of a grappler are you? She's pretty dangerous when it comes to her submission threat, but her overall grappling and ability to work to her submission position and also take the fight to the mat in the first place are actually pretty bad. So therefore she is submission or bust in every single fight. The only opponents that she's managed to beat are fighters who have historically had an issue with submission defense: Molly McCann and Jessica Rose Clark. So the obvious question is, how good of an anti-wrestler is Luana Carolina? I honestly couldn't be asked to watch tape, so I just leaned on the stats to paint the picture for us here, as I do think that there are genuine times where that can be very useful. At a glance, it's obvious that her stats are skewed by the Lupe Godinez fight. Godinez went 2 for 15 on takedowns landed, which does a lot to really ham up the numbers. If you take that fight away, her takedown defense is much, much lower. Even so, against all of the opponents that have taken her down, she's given up an average of 2 minutes and 10 seconds of control time per takedown, which is obviously concerning. What's even more concerning is that the names of the people who have provided those takedowns: Ivana Petrovic, don't really know anything about her; Molly McCann, the one I just said is a bad grappler; Joanne Wood, career-long kickboxer; and Poliana Botelho, who was just shit. None of those people are very good grapplers, so Stoliarenko is probably the best grappler that she's faced in a very long time. Definitely feels like a pick'em to me. Stoliarenko's against an opponent that she could have success against, but it's very easy to imagine the wheels falling off for Stoliarenko. I couldn't trust her to finish her dinner. Sorry for the analysis being lazy here and me just taking the piss with this breakdown, but honestly there are so many fights every single week across a year. I have to avoid burnout by cutting corners where I can, and I think you can forgive me for not wanting to do tape on a fight like this. I think it should be a pick'em. I don't think you should bet on it. You didn't really need me to tell you that. Next one. We have a UFC debutant in the next fight as Markel Mederos takes on Landon Quinones. I was not impressed at all with Landon Quinones on The Ultimate Fighter or in his debut against Nasrat Haqparast, really. It's very telling to me that he's lost more decisions than he's won in his career, and I think when you watch him fight you can kind of see why. It's usually the sign that you're not a very good striker when you can't win minutes, you can only win moments. He's not a terrible striker, but he clearly struggles against high volume opponents and guys who will have a high output and stay in his face. Markel Mederos makes his UFC debut here, and holy shit, that guy's regional tape was a pleasure to watch. His striking highlights are genuinely some of the best I have ever seen. He puts together combinations like he's conducting an orchestra. I'm not saying he's a world-class fighter, obviously, and he could have been fighting really shitty opposition, but if you do ever want to go and watch some regional tape, Markel Mederos has got the goods, I can tell you that. I bet the heavy bags at his gym are fucking terrified of him. So yeah, I clearly have very different opinions on the skill set of both men here. I think Landon Quinones is basically a walking punching bag that doesn't really do a whole lot to stop people from advancing on him, and Markel Mederos is putting together these jazzy 6-7 punch combinations whilst marching opponents down. So it's definitely a fight that I think Markel Mederos should be the favourite on. I was really disappointed to see that the books got off to a good start with Mederos. I was hoping that this one would be a pick'em or something, or that they'd just see him as another Contender Series guy. But Mederos is roughly minus 175 at the time of me recording this. I think that's definitely along the right lines in terms of the betting. Mederos' style is going to be one that's very judge-friendly compared to Quinones, and especially against a guy that has a tendency to shell up and succumb to volume like Quinones did against Nasrat. It's kind of hard to say exactly where the line should be, because there are still a lot of unknowns on both men, like what if Quinones starts grappling, and I have no idea how Mederos is going to deal with that. But considering the line on Mederos is dropping a bit, I would be inclined to get involved if I could get minus 150 or minus 160, very similar to how I felt about Gilbert Urbina versus Charles Radtke. So yeah, I have no problem with betting Mederos at minus 160 or better. I probably will put 2 units on that by the time Fight Night rolls around, as I think he should be a minus 200 favourite in this fight. Next up, we have a bout between two fat guys as Thomas Petersen faces Jamal Pogues. I had no idea who Thomas Petersen was, other than the fact that he comes from a college wrestling background and he beat up an obese man shaped like a barrel on Dana White's Contender Series. I always say that wrestling is a great base for MMA at heavyweight because opponents are just too round and unflexible to be able to get back to their feet like in other divisions, kind of like turtles. So yeah, when a fat fighter gets taken down, they're kind of just stuck there for the rest of the round is basically my summary. And if Petersen's going to be a grappler, he's probably going to find success in fighting like that. Jamal Pogues has only been taken down once in his UFC career, and he's faced only 3 attempts in his UFC career. That came against Josh Parisian, and he didn't even get fully grounded. He kind of just went to a knee and then got back to his feet. Therefore, I've absolutely no idea what to expect in terms of Pogues' takedown defense or his work on bottom. Therefore, I have absolutely no interest in betting this fight or picking a winner or anything along those lines. This is a complete mystery. It's like watching UFC 1. I don't really understand why anyone would want to bet on this. You might as well go to the casino and put your money on red or black at the roulette table. So yeah, no interest from me. And in our next fight, we have another short notice bout between Themba Gorimbo and Pete Rodriguez. By the time this fight had been announced, I'd done more than enough research on this card, so I didn't really look into it and do any tape on it. But then again, I don't really think you need to here. Themba Gorimbo is a dedicated and aggressive grappler, we know that, but we've also seen that he has pretty questionable cardio that would cause some problems if his fights drag out. Pete Rodriguez, on the other hand, is very much not UFC quality, and he came in on a short notice deal when he was a sacrificial lamb to Jack Della Maddalena. They said thank you and gave him Mike Jackson, who is an even worse level of competition. But Pete Rodriguez has to fight out his contract now, and he doesn't have any long-term value to the UFC. It's pretty obvious. So when you look at his actual fights, his 2 UFC performances lasted less than 3 minutes in total. Neither of them had any takedowns or any grappling, and his regional tape is exactly the same as that. Literally, I did not find a single second where he was on his back in the grappling realm. Therefore, without any tape on Rodriguez's grappling ability or his cardio, it's kind of impossible to have any real confidence in this fight, seeing as that's the kind of thing that Gorimbo is going to have strengths and weaknesses with as well. However, we do know that Gorimbo is obviously expected to win this one in the eyes of the UFC, simply because Rodriguez is very bottom of the barrel, and Themba's recent publicity stunts with The Rock have kind of turned him into a more marketable fighter that the UFC would obviously like to cash in on that. If the UFC have to save one person's career, it's obviously going to be Gorimbo's. So with that in mind, I was still pretty surprised to see that Gorimbo's just minus 225 on the betting line. Obviously, that's the bookies playing it safe with those unknowns about Gorimbo's cardio and also just Pete Rodriguez's ability in a grappling realm. But considering Gorimbo is going to be the favourite and all of the casual money will be on him, I thought they would have made the public pay a steeper price. Either way, I do think there is a decent prop angle you could take for this fight, and that would be to bet some sort of variation of Themba Gorimbo to win by submission in under 2.5 rounds. If you've got access to a same-game parlay builder, you can obviously make that exact bet. But if not, any sort of prop that comes from that sentence would be a good idea. Basically, the reason for that is that Themba Gorimbo's money line is essentially exactly the same as that mission statement, give or take a little bit more risk. We know that he has bad cardio, so nobody who's picking Themba is picking him to win by round 3 or by decision. And we know that Rodriguez is very green and untested on the mat, and that's where Themba likes to take things. So if Themba does land takedowns in round 1, which he very obviously should, he's got a really high potential of finding a finish there. And anyone who is thinking that he's going to win and picking him outright is very likely thinking of that path anyway. So when you consider that he is at something like 68-69% probability, it's very likely that so much of that probability is going to be via that method. So I think you're basically just getting yourself a better price on what is basically the money line. I'll probably be taking some variation of him to win by submission in under 2.5 rounds for half a unit. Obviously, we're so far away from props that I can't really speak on that yet, but it'll be a half unit bet. It's not a confident one. I think it's just a way of cleverly trimming down a money line bet that I already think could potentially have a little bit of value on it. And finally, our first fight of the night is one that was put together on short notice as Charles Johnson faces Azat Maksum. I respect the savvy matchmaking that's gone on from the UFC brass here, especially putting this one together on short notice. Azat Maksum came into the UFC with an exciting bit of rep. He was 16-0, which is a really appealing looking record, and obviously he's from Kazakhstan, which is a nation that's been very popular from an MMA perspective in the last few years. But unfortunately, his debut performance really did not live up to the hype. He squeaked by with a split decision win over Tyson Nam, who has a losing record in the UFC and a very unappealing record where he has half as many losses as he does wins. So they're giving Maksum the chance to try and relaunch his UFC career by giving him a journeyman that's clinging onto his UFC career by a thread, Charles Johnson. This feels very much like a sink or swim kind of opportunity for both fighters, as Johnson's inability to put together a conclusive 15-minute performance has already killed his chances of the matchmakers doing him any favours, and Maksum becomes yet another prospect that they can discard of if he can't beat the low demands of beating a fighter like Johnson, very much like Albert Duraev that I mentioned earlier on. Johnson's fights always look the same to me. He strikes competitively, but he just cannot stop an opponent that wants to grapple him. His takedown defense and his get-up game aren't atrocious at all, but all he does in fights is defend because he has really bad footwork, which doesn't earn him any kudos in the eye of the judges because they're not really able to score anything that he does from an offensive point of view. Maksum also showed that kind of aggressive grappling-based style in his win against Tyson Nam. He attempted 11 takedowns and he landed only 2 of them. Those figures look exactly kind of like what a Charles Johnson fight looks like in the UFC, so I think it's fair to assume we're going to get a similar-ish kind of fight taking place here. That instantly makes me think that this one could run quite close, because as much as Charles Johnson doesn't really do anything offensively a lot, he does a very good job of stifling his opponent, so he doesn't make them look very good either. Another thing that will make this fight close, in my opinion, is that Maksum's cardio did not look particularly amazing in the Nam fight, and it's very likely that Johnson will be able to squeak around in rounds 1 or 2, so the fact that Johnson has the opportunity against a guy who's probably going to be a bit more tired means that this one could really get a bit sketchy by round 3. So I don't really have any strong opinions here. I just think that Charles Johnson is a bit of a messy fighter, and the amount of controversial decisions and split decisions that he's been involved in his short time with the UFC kind of proves that point. It'll probably end up looking like a split decision in this kind of fight, but at least the unknowns on Maksum's side kind of means that there is a potential for him to look better than we expected, so I guess if I had to pick a favourite on this one, it would probably go Maksum's way. Probably around minus 135 would be where I would line it. However, the bookmakers aren't going to give us that price because who in their right mind would want to bet on Charles Johnson after everything he's done in his career? Once again, like so many of the fights on this card, it's just not an appealing prospect and I can't imagine putting my money on either guy, so I'm not going to. So there we have it. A card with a couple of exciting bouts, but not a whole lot of meat on the bone from a betting perspective. It's not the most interesting card I've ever seen top to bottom. Just to recap my bets before we finish up, we've got 2 units on Nassourdine Imavov to win at minus 150, 1.5 units on Drew Dober to win at plus 110 or better, 0.5 units on Drew Dober to win by KO at plus 175 or better, 2 units on Randy Brown to win that closes out a parlay with Lioness Petersen under 2.5 rounds at minus 130, 3 units on Natalia Silva to win, which closes out a parlay with Jasmine Jasudavicius at minus 120, 1 unit on both Randy Brown and Natalia Silva to win at plus 100, 2 units on Gilbert Urbina to win at minus 175, 2 units on Markel Mederos to win at minus 160 or better, and 0.25 units on my parlay pieces, which comes out to plus 833, and those are Nassourdine Imavov, Randy Brown, Natalia Silva, Gilbert Urbina, and Markel Mederos all to win. And finally, my dog of the week, which currently I'm sitting at 2-0 for 2024. This week it will be Drew Dober. So that's it. That's the whole card, top to bottom. I'll be back next week for the Pyfer versus Hermansson card. I will catch you then.